So hi everyone, my name's Gabriel Levine. I'm a professor in the Drama Studies program at Glendon campus of York University, as well as in Theater and Performance Studies graduate program at the main campus.
And I'm Shelby Shapiro. I'm a fourth year Drama Studies and English Studies student at Glendon campus of York University.
And we're going to talk to you about a project that we were involved in last year, as well as called The Housing Show, a kind of collective creation student performance project, and how it responded to and articulated with a project called Talking Treaties, a much larger project by Jumblies Theatre, a community engaged theater and performance and community art company in Toronto, under this project under the direction of theater artist Ange Loft. And we'll think a little bit about how these two projects, which are both documentary, verbatim puppet theater projects in some way, how they articulate with each other and also with some of the conference themes, partitioning, ensembles, performances of sharing and division, particularly focusing on the treaty relationship and relationships between Indigenous people and between Indigenous people and settlers on this land. So before we begin, we just want to give a little special thanks.
Yes, so we'd just like to acknowledge the images and video stills that appear in our presentation. So thank you very much to Natalie Logan for providing all of the documentation of the housing show. And thank you to Ange Loft and Jumblies Theatre for all of the beautiful photos of the Talking Treaties project that we have sourced from their website.
So here's what we're going to do in the next 15 to 20 minutes. I'll give a little introduction to the Talking Treaties project, how I encountered it and what it is.
And I will explain and sort of give an understanding of the workshop that we did with Jumblies Theatre and Ange Loft.
I'll talk a little bit about the origin of the housing show, how I conceived and initiated the project.
And then I will discuss the process of the housing show and how we created it.
And then we'll talk a little bit about points of contact and divergence between these two projects. So Talking Treaties is an ongoing, large-scale, community-engaged project that's had a number of different forms. You're seeing here video stills from a presentation, an installation that was done at the Toronto Biennial of Art this past year. It's under the direction of Ange Loft, who's an Associate Artistic Director of Jumblies Theatre. She's from Kahnawake Mohawk territory, interdisciplinary artist who does all kinds of fantastic work. And she's also doing a major presentation at the CATR conference this year. So I first encountered Talking Treaties in its form as a large-scale spectacle, the Talking Treaties spectacle at historic Fort York in Toronto, now Toronto, in 2017 and again in 2018. It's a project that has this archival research dimension, thanks to historian Victoria Freeman and others. It also integrates testimony from Indigenous voices. It has a kind of ongoing community performance engagement with a choir and a performance ensemble for participants with mixed abilities. And it has resulted in these kind of multiple performance musical installation outcomes, and it's still happening at the current moment. And when she talks about treaty and treaty making in this project, tends to kind of think about different layers of treaty making, not just the conventional ones that we perhaps hear more about. So she begins with thinking about what she calls natural law, or the treaty making between all living beings, animals, humans, plants, the land, and then extending that to treaty making between Indigenous nations, mostly from before European colonization. And a major focus of this project is on the Dish with One Spoon covenant between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples of the northern Great Lakes region, which is the land on which we are currently, and the land really that this project is concerned with. And then finally, thinking about treaty making between Indigenous nations and settlers, we're focusing particularly on the Treaty of Niagara of 1764, and then the Toronto Purchase, so-called, in which title for this land on which Toronto now sits was kind of in a rather shady and underhanded way taken from the current treaty holders and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation in 1787 and again in 1805. So the spectacle, as I mentioned, was what first drew me into this project. I went to see it a couple of times in these 2 different years, or a few times I should say. And it's a mix of performance techniques that I'm also quite drawn to. There's a verbatim text element, there's song and music. Outdoor pageantry with puppets and objects is a very strong material performance dimension to this project. All kinds of materials bear a lot of the theatrical weight. It's a processional performance. It's promenade-style theater. They move the audience from place to place. It's site-specific. It's engaged with this place, historic Fort York, which is also right downtown in Toronto City Place, and also has movement and other theatrical elements. So it's a really multifarious theatrical experience that I found quite inspiring. And I wanted to respond to it in some way through research, but then I also thought that performance might be a way to really respond a little more effectively to this project. And one of the things that I did in preparation for the housing show, but also on a couple of other occasions, was invite Ange and her collaborators into classes, drama classes at Glendon, to do workshops on treaty making and the treaty relationship.
Yeah, so in late 2019, Ange and 2 other representatives of Jumblies Theatre came to do a workshop with our theatre class, which later served for us as an inspiration for our own production, the housing show. Together, one of the activities that we did was to create a large map from a collection of smaller individual pieces of paper that we were then given to record our own interpretations of the workshop as we went along and the Toronto purchase. And you can see a couple of them here. One of the large focuses of the workshop was learning about the history of the land of Toronto, as Toronto was the focus of our show. And one of which was the Toronto Purchase, as Gabe has mentioned, which happened in 1787 and 1805, and which was the real history of how Toronto, or the land of Toronto, was acquired by the British Crown from the Indigenous communities already living there, and how it happened, as well as learning a bit more of positive elements like before all else and the idea of Thanksgiving, which is a Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving prayer, which acknowledges the relationships that we have with the earth and each other, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people alike. Another focus was the materials and representation and how they work together in performance. We used paper, drawing, manipulating objects and materials to tell different stories and explore different pasts, which then led us to make our own short performances, which we performed for each other, about our own interpretations of the Toronto Purchase and what we learned in the workshop. There were certain elements that we also learned about materials and representation, such as how symbols and interpretation can challenge our instinctual assumptions and force us to re-examine what and how we think about Toronto, home, and Indigenous customs, as well as certain symbols that are inherently tied to the idea of colonialism and others, which are more closely linked to the history of Indigenous practices.
And one of the things I love about Ange's pedagogy is, using materials to get participants in a workshop to make performances, with about 20 minutes of preparation. She calls it often a quick creation workshop. So that's extremely helpful in getting students just going and making performance in response to what is obviously an extremely difficult and heavy history. So kind of parallel to engaging with the Talking Treaties project, I had this idea to do a performance, a devised collective creation performance with students about the housing crisis in Toronto. And it eventually became this project called The Housing Show, which we performed March 5th through 7th this past spring. So just the week before COVID lockdown made this kind of theatrical experience impossible. One thing I have been thinking about is really, the experience of the housing crisis is such an everyday experience. We're all experiencing it in Toronto in one way or another, where housing has become unattainable for some. There's a homelessness crisis. There's a crisis of affordability, which really, you know, people experience it differently depending on class background. Racialized people are much more affected by it in the city, and Indigenous people as well. So all of these kind of social divisions, which are extremely marked in the city of Toronto, a highly unequal city, also have a parallel in the partitioning and the divisions of the land. Again, going back to the Toronto Purchase, you're seeing an image of it here. So I wanted to kind of bring those ideas together and think about this violent transformation of a treaty relationship, which should be a living relationship based on mutual respect and gifts, to the expropriation of land and its transformation into property. So in that context, thinking about what does it mean for us with all of our divisions to live together in some way, ensemble, on this land. I also, and Toronto has a particularly fraught existence in this kind of confluence of divisions, you know, incredible inequality in this city, unbelievable wealth and precarity at the same time. I'd also gotten interested in public consultations as theatrical events. If you've ever been to one, they do have this highly theatrical, stagey even dimension. And I'd been to a couple of them for the fortunately now defunct Sidewalk Labs Google takeover of downtown Toronto called the Quayside Project. And these were amazing theatrical events that had this interesting structure where there was a kind of whole group presentation for a couple hundred people. Then we'd split into these smaller group discussion sessions around a table. So 8 to 10 participants with members of Waterfront Toronto Board around a table, and then reconvening for a kind of closing Q&A plenary. And I thought, oh, what an interesting theatrical structure. So we adapted this in our version of this performance, the housing show that we did at Glendon. We had 3 parts. The first part was a mock public consultation on affordable housing done in the Glendon cafeteria, so in a kind of public institutional space. We used verbatim text to create this part of the piece and wove it together into a mock public dialogue that got quite contentious. Then we broke the audience into groups, moved them into the theater, and performers did what we called table shows. So rather than discussion groups, they were little shows around a table, and using objects and puppets to kind of delve into aspects of the housing crisis a little more playfully and creatively. And finally, as a kind of closing group piece, instead of having another public conversation, we did a movement, sound, and text piece called Land and Water that really was about the land and about the treaty relationship, drawing on some of the material, including the visual material from the Talking Treaties workshop with students.
Yes, so much of the process of the housing show happened before the production, and it actually consisted a lot of preparation and research. So the process of creation began with the research, where we learned a lot about the history of collective creation and using object theater and as production. And we read current articles about the Toronto housing crisis, and talked about those issues and how they could contribute to our overall show, which eventually led to us each interviewing someone subjected to Toronto's current housing state in the current issues that surround the Toronto housing crisis. And though much of our production was focused on, or much of the early work of our production focused on learning about the issues at hand, which we intended our show to address, we explored a lot of objects and movement and how they relate to one another, as well as playing with stage and play space. However, one of the things we struggled with was the issue of voice. And though everyone in the collective has experience living in Toronto and as a Toronto resident, and the crisis that we are all experiencing, there were some key voices that were missing from our ensemble, which during our production and creation process, we kind of struggled with creating certain stereotypes and caricatures of what homelessness looks like. However, I think that that led to some conversations which we really had to rethink how we wanted to portray that. And because of the problematic ideas, we sort of managed to reestablish the show in a different fashion to portray a different level of truth.
And it was, let me just say, it was really the verbatim work that helped to move us out of kind of caricatures and fantasies about homelessness and housing precarity by students going and doing interviews with people affected by the housing crisis. They really got much closer to understanding these divisions that have been really marking the city.
Yeah, and though I think that we did a great job to kind of learn and progress forward, one of the issues upon reflection of our show is that we were addressing the Indigenous history of Canada without an Indigenous voice present in our group. And though we had our wonderful workshop with Jumblies Theatre and Ange Loft, and it was helpful in enlightening us to the issue of the Toronto Purchase and the taking and settlement of the British Crown on the land of Toronto, we didn't really want to impose our own opinions and voices over those that deserve to be heard the most, which is why we decided to shift our focus from our land acknowledgement away from an apology for all of the history of Toronto and more of an acknowledgement that though the issues are still very much present and we're not necessarily in the moment doing anything to add those voices to our collective, though we would like to, we are acknowledging that they are not present and that it is an issue that needs to be talked about.
Absolutely. And that, by the way, when Shelby's referring to the land acknowledgement, it was sort of part of this final section, land and water. So although there was a kind of more institutional land acknowledgement at the beginning of the consultation section, as it would be and is done in public consultations, we kind of turn the last part of the show into this, in part an acknowledgement of an absence of our ability and membership in the collective to really bring these Indigenous voices forward. So thinking a little bit about points of contact and divergence between these performances, you know, the housing show was in some ways inspired by Talking Treaties, which is obviously a much larger and more impressive project than our student performance. But nonetheless, we tried to kind of take up some of the invitations and questions and in some ways performance styles experimented with in the Talking Treaties project. So one thing that I think is really profound about Talking Treaties is that it really is a kind of call in to the treaty relationship, that it's inviting participants and audience members to really feel that relationship as living relationship. I mean, I think that's the key idea in that project, in a way, that a treaty is not something that's done in the past and then finished. It's an ongoing commitment to live together, to share the land, to find an equitable and just way of doing this. So I felt in terms of that call in, one way to respond is to do a performance, as a kind of responsive performance to that call, and find ways of integrating that into our performance, which wasn't just about the treaty relationship, but also looked about at other kinds of inequity, of race, of class, of the kind of housing precarity experienced by queer people in the city, and other kinds of divisions that are really marked on this land. But there is often this kind of paralysis of settler subjects when you look at the brutal history of colonization and expropriation of the land. What can we do? Oh my God, it's so horrible. So this is just one small way of trying to explore how we can live together better on this land. Shelby, do you want to say anything about this slide?
Sure. Yeah, so I found that both of the shows really had partitioning as a major theme visually and physically in the shows. Toronto, the Talking Treaties project, much like our own, moves the audience around to different locations, physically separating them. And our show as well manages to do that, both in the three segments of our show as individual parts that all come together to form a cohesive whole, but as well as, moving the audience from one location to the other, as well as physically separating the audience into two groups to then go individually to the table shows, which really in itself kind of is representative of the division of the land and the Toronto Purchase and its symbolic division into different segments.
And that's something that we tried to put at the heart of our show in the consultation as well, where there was a panel of experts where, you know, certain folks, a planner and a human rights housing lawyer, really did emphasize that settler colonial division of the land was fundamental to housing precarity in the city. The fact that land has become a matter of private ownership and financial speculation is really at the heart of housing precarity and inequality, and needs to be addressed by other visions of land ownership. So we tried to put that forward in our own small way in the performance. So thinking in conclusion here, we're just ending with an image from Talking Treaties of the audience, mostly holding visual images on the grounds of historic Fort York. Shelby, do you want to say anything, any final thoughts here?
Yeah, much like the relationship between the two parts of the two shows in partitioning, there was also this coming together vibe that both of the shows kind of, though they addressed partitioning and symbolically or metaphorically represented it, the main idea of the show was to come together as a whole and to acknowledge the past in dialogue and to use real voices and experiences to learn from our own past in the present, and to recognize that in both of these contexts there is a serious element of displacement and feelings of homelessness or being without a place.
I think that's really true. And you know, in that coming together, in that ensemble that these performances are striving to achieve, there's also still the acknowledgement of divisions that are not going to be healed or papered over. You know, it doesn't have to be an ensemble without division, that those partitionings between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, the kinds of inequities experienced along the lines of race and class can't just be smoothed over and you can't pretend they don't exist. They're real. So even in this coming together, those divisions are still present and important. And on the other hand, you know, given this kind of heaviness of these histories, I think something really powerful in both of these projects is a kind of playfulness with regard to that history that's often, as I mentioned, facilitated through materiality, through objects, through puppet theater techniques. That playing with materials is one way to kind of dislodge some of the stuckness of this history and get us moving together with all our differences in new ways. So that's pretty much, I think, what we have to say about these two projects. We invite you to check out the links that we're providing as well to a website that Shelby made about the housing show, where you can see video footage of this project. You can also take a look on the Jumblies Theatre website at the Talking Treaties project. And yeah, we look forward to engaging with you in the comments and back and forth following this presentation. So yeah, thanks so much for watching.
Thank you.